Okay, so, you with your philosophical mind, you sent us on this fascinating quest
Mm-hmm.
into the thought of David Hume on religion.
Yes.
Um, and forget the usual Sunday sermon.
Yeah.
We are diving deep into a systematic and skeptical critique
Mm-hmm.
that still resonates with philosophers even today.
That's right.
Right.
Right. It does.
So,
Yeah, this deep dive is going to unpack Hume's, how should we say, irreligious intentions, and we're going to be focusing specifically on the central intellectual battle of his era.
right.
So the clash between those who, through speculative reasoning, questioned or denied God's existence, and the religious philosophers who wanted to defend belief on rational ground.
Right. So it's like
We're looking
a
at
high-stakes philosophical debate.
yeah, high stakes debate.
Exactly.
And to kind of navigate this complex terrain,
Yeah.
we are drawing from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Hume on religion.
Great source.
Right.
A comprehensive overview of his argument. And our mission today is to really extract the most important nuggets
Yes.
of Hume's thought on the philosophical foundations of religious belief.
Mm-hmm.
And we want to tailor this for your sharp philosophical curiosity
Okay.
and kind of explore whether we can accurately label him as an atheist.
Right.
Okay, so let's kind of unpack the intellectual landscape
Yeah.
that Hume found himself in.
Sure.
Because it was far from a neutral ground.
Absolutely not. No. While contemporary philosophical discussions of the 18th century often center on that, empiricist rationalist divide,
Right.
the most, intense and pervasive debate was about God's existence or not. It was a head-to-head confrontation between these speculative atheists, as they're called, and the religious philosophers.
Yeah.
Each side was armed with rigorous arguments.
And these religious philosophers were no intellectual slouches.
No.
This is often called the golden period of English theology, and it featured thinkers like Henry Moore,
Yes.
Ralph Cudworth,
John Locke. Samuel Clarke.
George Berkeley,
Berkeley.
and Joseph Butler.
Names.
They were heavyweights.
Yeah, absolutely. They were dedicated to, constructing rational defenses for Christian belief against, what they perceived as this growing tide of skepticism and outright atheism.
Right, so they had to really ground these theological claims
Yeah, they felt...
in solid bedrock.
I felt this need to ground these theological claims in reason to effectively counter these challenges.
Yeah, and on the other side, there was a significant skeptical tradition.
Yes.
Gaining momentum with key figures like Thomas Hobbes.
Of course.
And Benedict Spinoza.
Yes.
And their work, while sharing some common threads, often featured anti-clerical sentiments and critical analysis of biblical texts, skepticism about miracles, and a leaning towards materialistic and deterministic worldviews.
You were shaking the foundations.
Right.
For sure.
And, the influence wasn't limited to these two.
No.
Right? Pyrrhonian skepticism.
Yes.
Largely popularized by Pierre Bayle.
That's right.
A thinker that Hume was very familiar with.
Oh, yeah. He engaged with...
Played a crucial role.
Yes.
And he argued that theology demands absolute certainty.
Yes.
To be valid.
To be valid, right.
And that this radical doubt of Pyrrhonism just obliterates that.
It just obliterates it, right?
So what's fascinating is that Bayle's own proposed solution was to just separate the realms of philosophy and theology.
Yeah, a strict separation.
Right, and so he suggested that theological doctrines couldn't actually withstand rational inquiry, and they were just matters of faith. Of course, this led to accusations of atheism.
Of course it did.
Right, so this gives us a context for why Hume would also be labeled an atheist.
Yes, exactly. And then as a direct response to this perceived atheistic threat, we have the Boyle Lectures, which were established.
Right.
You can think of them as this institutional effort to arm Christian theology with intellectual firepower against notorious infidels, particularly atheists.
Okay.
Right?
So they're giving them the tools.
Samuel Clarke was a prominent figure in Newtonian thought. Became a leading voice through these lectures, advocating for the cosmological argument and integrating Newtonian physics into this theological framework.
Right.
So,
Newtonian theology.
Newtonian theology, exactly.
And let's not overlook the intellectual climate closer to home for Hume.
That's right.
Because his Scottish contemporaries were deeply involved in this debate as well.
Yes, they were.
Right. So we have thinkers like Andrew Baxter, who defended Clarke's cosmological arguments.
Mm-hmm.
And Newtonians like George Chain and Colin Maclaurin, who were really big on this argument from design.
Yes.
And so Hume, as a student at Edinburgh, and, being in those intellectual circles who had been very aware.
He would have been aware of those discussions.
Of these discussions going on.
For sure.
And the specific arguments.
Right. And this brings us to Hume's own philosophical toolkit.
Yeah.
Starting with his empiricism.
Of course.
For any philosopher examining Hume's critique of religious ideas, this is the essential starting point. Right?
It's the lens through which he's viewing everything.
Yeah.
And evaluating all claims.
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about something so far-reaching as God.
Right.
Right? And the inherent potential for empiricism to lead to skepticism about, our knowledge of God was recognized by Hobbes.
Right.
He famously argued that since all our imaginative capacities are finite, we can form no positive, comprehensible idea of an infinite God.
Right.
So for Hobbes, God becomes this necessary postulate, like the inferred cause of the universe, but ultimately something beyond our grasp.
So it's like a blind person can know the effect of fire.
Almost agnostic.
Yes, like a blind person can know the effect of fire, its warmth.
Right.
But without having any true sensory experience of what it is.
So very minimalist.
Yes, a purely negative theology in essence.
Right. And this minimalist approach provoked opposition.
Oh, of course.
From those who wanted a more robust understanding of God.
Yes.
Right? So religious thinkers of the time employed various strategies to kind of overcome these limitations of empiricism.
They did.
Some, following the rationalist tradition, argued for innate ideas or the inherent power of reason to apprehend God. Others, like Locke, tried to construct the idea of God by reflecting on and amplifying our simple ideas derived from experience. And then there's this analogical approach championed by people like Peter Brown, who suggested that we can understand God by drawing analogies to our own attributes.
Yeah, to our own attributes and perfections. Exactly.
But what's crucial for understanding Hume is his copy principle.
Yes, his famous copy principle, first laid out in the treatise.
Right.
And this is this radical assertion that all our ideas, without exception, are derived from our impressions.
Okay.
So our direct sensory experiences of the world are our internal feelings and reflections.
Right.
If an idea cannot be traced back to a corresponding impression, Hume says it's without clear meaning.
Right.
It's an empty word, basically.
Okay, so given the importance of the copy principle in Hume's system, one might expect that he would examine the idea of God right away in the treatise.
Right.
But surprisingly, he doesn't.
Well, for a philosopher as systematic and deliberate as Hume, it's unlikely to be an accident.
Yeah.
I think it's more plausible to interpret this relative silence as a deliberate philosophical strategy. It's a subtle but powerful way of signaling his deep skepticism.
So he's sending a message without saying anything.
Yeah, a skeptical message conveyed through omission.
Yeah.
A dog that doesn't bark at the divine.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
But when Hume does address the idea of God more explicitly in the Enquiry, he seems to give this more Locke an account. Right? And he's suggesting that we kind of arrive at the idea of God by reflecting on our own minds and then kind of infinitely augmenting qualities like goodness and wisdom and power.
Yeah.
So is this a shift in his thinking?
Well, not so fast.
Okay.
Because to truly grasp his position, we need to look at his private correspondence alongside his published works.
Right.
So in a letter to William Muir, which was written between the publication of the treatise and the Enquiry, he gives a different perspective.
Okay.
One much closer to Hobbes.
Okay.
He argues that God lacking any sensory or emotional impact and minimally accessible to our understanding through reasoning remains unknown to us and incapable of engaging our affections.
So it's very similar to the Hobbesian view.
Yes, and he even criticizes enthusiasts who fabricate a God in their own image because they want to make the divine more comprehensible.
Right.
And he sees that as a degradation.
Okay, so that's a pretty stark contrast
Yes.
with what he said in the Enquiry.
It is.
So it seems like he's being a little bit more complex.
It seems that way, yeah.
Yeah.
More strategic.
Yeah. And in section Ec 11 of the Enquiry,
which is titled
Of a Particular Providence and of a Future State,
yes,
he takes this reasoning further and critiques our attempts to understand God.
Mm-hmm.
By looking at the design of the world,
Yes.
he emphasizes the radical difference and infinite superiority
Right.
of God compared to human nature.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And this gulf makes it impossible to get any clear ideas
Yes.
about God
That's right.
based on what we know as humans.
Yes, and as he famously says, the deity is known to us only by his productions.
Right.
Highlighting the limitations.
We just see the effects.
Yes.
And we can't work backwards.
Exactly. It's like trying to understand the painter
Mm.
by only looking at the paintings
Right.
without seeing the artist or the methods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in part X of his dialogues concerning natural religion,
Yes.
he makes this point about the problem of evil even stronger.
Yes.
And he argues that if, as observation suggests,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
neither man nor any animal are happy,
Mm-hmm.
then this all-powerful God
Right.
must either be unable or unwilling to stop suffering.
Right.
And this undermines any analogy
Mm-hmm.
between the divine and human.
Yes. If a perfectly powerful and benevolent being existed, why would there be this widespread misery?
So to kind of synthesize Hume's view
Yes.
on the idea of God,
Mm-hmm.
despite him appearing to have this lock-in approach in the inquiry,
Mm.
he emphasizes the limits of our understanding.
Yeah, and he consistently underscores the vast,
Right.
maybe unbridgeable chasm between our finite experience-bound understanding
Yeah.
and the supposed infinite and transcendent nature of God.
Right.
So the copy principle, when rigorously applied,
Yeah.
casts this long skeptical shadow over any claims
Right.
to have clear and distinct ideas about divine attributes.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, so let's move on to one of the traditional cornerstones of philosophical theology.
yes,
The cosmological argument.
the cosmological argument.
Right, so this is the idea that the universe needs a first uncaused cause.
Right.
And this is God.
Right. A foundational argument
Yeah.
in metaphysics with a lineage stretching back to the ancient world.
Right, and interestingly, even Lucretius, in his atheistic work, De Rerum Natra, used a very simple causal principle. Nothing can come from nothing.
Mm-hmm.
To argue for the eternality of matter.
Mm-hmm.
And this suggests that it doesn't need a creator.
Right.
But then 17th and 18th century religious philosophers kind of turned this around.
Yes, they turned it on its head.
Yeah. And they employed what we might call derived causal principles, like the causal maxim. Everything that begins to exist has a cause, and the principle of causal adequacy.
A cause must have at least the perfections found in its effect.
Right. So they're using these to build a case for God.
Yes, as the necessary first cause.
As the first cause.
That's right.
Right. And Hume, as the skeptic, he is
Of course.
subjected these causal foundations to scrutiny.
For sure.
Right. And so his most direct attack on the cosmological argument is in part 9 of the Dialogues,
Look at dialogue.
where he addresses a version popularized by Samuel Clarke,
Yes.
the argument for a necessarily existent being.
Mm-hmm.
And so Clarke argued that an infinite regress of causes is impossible.
Yes. And that we must arrive at a being whose non-existence is a contradiction.
Right.
A being that exists by its own necessity.
Right.
And he also argued that matter could not be this original being because it's contingent
Okay.
and incapable of explaining the origin of motion and intelligence.
Right.
So he invoked the principle of causal adequacy.
Right. The cause must be more excellent
Right.
than the effect.
And Clarke's argument basically says that the chain of causes can't go back forever.
Yeah, it has to stop.
It has to stop with this perfect being
Mm-hmm.
who is responsible for everything else.
Responsible for everything else,
We're-
including the active and intelligent aspects of the universe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then Hume launches this counteroffensive,
He died.
right? Drawing from his arguments from the treatise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He contends that it's possible.
Conceivable.
Conceivable, yeah.
Yeah.
That something can begin to exist without any cause at all.
Without any
Correct. And he says that our experience of causation is just constant conjunction.
constant conjunction.
We see things happening one after the other,
Mm-hmm.
but there's not a necessary connection between them.
We don't see that necessary connection.
Right.
We just see them constantly conjoined.
Right. And so there's no absurdity
Yeah.
in this idea in an uncaused beginning.
And as for the principle of causal adequacy,
Yes.
Hume says anything may produce anything.
Anything may produce anything.
Right.
There's no a priori reason why matter, given the right conditions, couldn't give rise to thought or consciousness.
Right.
And our everyday experience shows a close connection between those two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Hume is basically saying that if nothing comes from nothing,
Right.
isn't necessarily true, then the need for a divine creator is weakened.
Right? It's weakened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he even suggests...
He plays with the idea that maybe the will of a powerful being, even a finite one, could be responsible for creation.
Right.
So maybe you don't need...
So maybe you don't need
an infinite...
a big, all-powerful God.
Or maybe you don't.
Right.
Yeah. This challenges the notion that matter is inherently passive and incapable of being the ultimate source of things like thought.
And what about this concept of necessary existence?
Well, Hume...
The idea that God can't not exist.
He systematically deconstructs this notion in the dialogues. He argues that nothing that is demonstrably true can have a logically conceivable opposite, but we can imagine anything as not existing.
Even God.
Even God.
Right.
Right. So belief in God, he claims, doesn't add any content to our idea of his qualities. And we lack any distinct idea of existence itself.
Right. So
it becomes a meaningless assertion.
Necessary existence doesn't...
Necessary existence is meaningless.
Mean anything.
Right.
Right. And so if we can imagine matter not existing...
Yes.
Then the same applies to God.
Same applies to God.
Right.
So this necessarily existent trump card is revoked.
Is taken away.
Yeah.
And he also addresses this argument that an infinite series of causes needs a cause.
Right.
And he uses an analogy.
He uses this clever analogy.
Right. And he says, imagine several counties.
Right.
And if you've explained the existence of each county, do you then need a separate overarching cause for the kingdom?
For the kingdom.
Yes. Right. And he suggests that explaining the parts might just be enough.
It might be enough.
To explain the whole.
To explain the whole.
Right.
Now, of course, some might argue that understanding the links in a chain doesn't explain why the chain itself exists.
Yeah, but
he acknowledges that. Hume acknowledges that.
Yeah. That
these are difficult questions.
Yeah.
But his point is that trying to find a cause for the universe goes way beyond human understanding.
Yeah.
It might just be a brute fact.
Yeah.
That we have to just accept.
Right. And he even connects this back to Descartes.
Yes.
Right. And his ontological argument.
His famous ontological argument.
All right. So the idea that...
The very concept of a perfect being.
Yeah. Implies its existence.
Implies its existence.
Right. And he argues that even if we have an idea of a perfect being, we don't know that God is the source of that idea.
That's right. We don't have a basis for that.
Yeah. And existence isn't a perfection that's implied by any idea.
Right. Existence is not a perfection.
Including God.
So Descartes' argument fails.
Collapses.
Yeah.
So
Hume has
dismantled the a priori argument.
He's dismantled them.
Right.
And now let's look at the argument from design,
right.
which many consider the most persuasive argument.
Right. This apparent order and complexity in the world.
Yeah. And while the cosmological and ontological arguments operate in this realm of abstract reasoning, the argument from design has this broad appeal.
Right.
Its proponents claim it's so self-evident that even a hardened skeptic can't deny it.
Right.
And Hume engages with this argument extensively in section of his inquiry and in much greater detail in the dialogues, as well as references in the natural history of religion.
Okay, so initially in the dialogues, Philo, who we think represents Hume, seems to agree. Right. He agrees that the cause of the universe exists and that we might even be justified in saying it's perfect and calling it God.
Yes.
But then he says that we can't really comprehend God.
Right. We can't really comprehend his attributes.
Oh, right.
Or assume that they resemble human perfections.
Right.
Yeah. So Philo right away adopts this position of qualified agnosticism. So we can acknowledge a first cause, but its nature is a mystery. Then Cleanthes, who champions the design argument, steps forward and points to the order and adaptations in the world and says, this resembles human-made things. So we should infer a divine intelligence.
Okay, so basically, the world is like a machine,
Yes.
and machines have designers. Therefore, the world has a designer.
That's the basic analogy.
Right.
Yeah, the argument hinges on this analogy
Yeah.
between the ordered universe and human artifacts.
Right.
So we infer design from order and conclude that the cause,
Which is God.
which is God,
Right.
must be intelligent and have purpose,
But Philo is skeptical.
as always.
Right.
Of course.
And he points out weaknesses
Yeah,
in the reasoning.
he does.
And he says that an argument from analogy
Mm-hmm.
really depends on the resemblance between things.
Right, the degree of resemblance.
And human artifacts are so different from the universe
Yes, they are so different.
that the similarities are superficial.
Superficial.
Right.
And the inferences are uncertain.
And Hume uses the analogy of a house.
Mm-hmm.
We see a house and we assume there's a builder.
Right. Because we have experience.
Because they've seen it before.
We have experience of houses being built by humans.
Right.
But with the universe, we have one example.
Right.
We have no experience of its creation or its cause.
Right.
We lack that constant conjunction of universe makers and universes.
So we can't just jump from seeing order to saying there's a divine designer.
It's too big of a leap. Like trying to understand a galaxy from looking at a dust mote.
Right.
Yeah.
And then Cleanthes says,
He tries to counter this.
yeah, he's like,
Okay. Yeah.
but imagine a voice from the clouds.
Right.
You would think that's intelligent.
You would assume intelligence.
All right.
But Philo says
But Philo says no.
that leads to anthropomorphism,
Right.
giving God human-like qualities, which contradicts, traditional theology about God's transcendence.
Okay. And
And then Hume, through Philo, emphasizes this principle that a cause must be proportionate to its effect.
Right.
So we can't say God has infinite perfections
Right.
based on the limited things we see.
In the world.
Yes.
Right. And he points out that there are imperfections.
Right, like many inexplicable difficulties in the works of nature.
Right. And so how can we say the creator is perfect?
Yeah, how can we be certain
If creation isn't.
if creation isn't?
Right. And Hume cautions us against assuming God's perfection and then rationalizing a flawed world.
Yes, we have to base our understanding on what we actually observe.
Right.
Yeah.
And this brings us back to the problem of evil.
Oh, yes.
Right. How can a perfect creator be responsible
For a world
for a world full of suffering?
with so much suffering.
Right. And Hume, through Philo, isn't saying God isn't perfect,
No.
but he's questioning whether we can know that.
Know that he's perfect.
Yeah.
Right.
And Philo concludes that even if we say the universe has design,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't tell us anything about God.
It doesn't tell us about his nature or attributes.
Right.
He even introduces these alternative ideas,
Right.
like the world being created by an infant or senile deity,
Right.
to show how weak
The analogy is.
the analogy is. So theists are in a dilemma.
Right.
If they say there's a close analogy, they end up with an anthropomorphic God.
Right.
But if they say God is unknowable,
Mm-hmm.
it's basically atheism.
And then at the end of the dialogues,
Yes.
Philo seems to say that there is a great analogy.
Right.
But then,
But this is where we get the double reversal.
Right.
He immediately qualifies this
yeah,
and emphasizes the difference
between humans
between human designers
and God.
and the divine creator.
Right.
He calls this difference great and immeasurable because incomprehensible
Right. And the analogy he allows,
is described as remote and uncertain.
so even the concession is undermined.
Yes, it's undermined.
Right.
Yeah, and this is consistent with what he says in the inquiry,
Right. That God is so remote and incomprehensible.
that any attempt to understand him
Right.
is futile.
Yeah. So the argument from design
Yes.
fails.
It crumbles
Yeah,
under
yeah.
Hume's scrutiny.
Right.
Yeah,
So Hume has challenged the arguments for God,
he has.
right? But he also confronts the problem of evil,
Yes, he does.
not just as a critique of design,
No, but as a
but
separate,
as its own problem.
its own problem.
Right. And so in part X of the dialogues,
Yeah.
he brings up Epicurus's old questions.
Yes.
Right. So is God willing to prevent evil but unable? Then he's not all-powerful.
Not omnipotent.
Right. Or is he able but unwilling?
Then he's malevolent.
Right. And if he's both, then why is there evil?
Right. These are simple but profound questions.
Right.
That challenge God's goodness
Yeah.
and unlimited power.
And this forces theists to deny the reality of evil.
Right.
Right. Or say that it's necessary
For a greater good
for a greater good.
that we don't understand.
Yeah.
But Hume rejects this.
Right. And he says
He says,
that denying evil is just against our experience.
Yes, it contradicts experience and natural sentiments.
And through Philo, he talks about all the suffering.
Yes, a vivid and disturbing picture. Host speaker.